I'm Claire Parker.
And I'm Ashley Hamilton. And this is Celebrity Memoir Book Club, where we take the ripe story of the hour and report it back to you, unbiased and unflinching. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this.
No. We're still here.
I'm just kidding. We're so biased and flinching. And if you don't like that about us, you can flinch off. Claire, if you were to write a memoir, what would you title last week's chapter?
I don't know. What would you?
I'm going to choose to not talk about the talking abouts. And I'm going to talk about how I'm a liar.
You're a liar.
Just like our country's great politicians. In 2018 or 2019, I ran a marathon and I said, I'm never doing that again. And last week we watched the New York Marathon, and all week I've been thinking, like, there's nothing I want more than to run the New York Marathon.
I'm excited for you. Well, you weren't lying. You're never going to do like the Wisconsin Marathon again.
I said quite specifically, I never want to run a race ever again, let alone a marathon, specifically a marathon. I will never run a marathon.
You talk all the fucking time. That's why I only listen to about half of it.
I know. And I just want to run the New York City Marathon so bad. So I'm going to apply for next year. And if I don't get it, then I guess I'll apply the year after. So that's my truth. Claire, back to you.
Thanks for that, Ashley. Coming in from the left chair.
My left or stage left?
My left.
Okay.
I guess I didn't drink a lot of water this week and I didn't feel so good. I wish I had drank more water.
That's so important.
Less a memoir chapter and more just
a general reminder for the public.
I don't know. This week is a blank. A blur and a blank.
Well, you heard it here first. Over to you, Connie, for today's main report.
So this book starts with chapter 1, male envy. And she talks about how she didn't want to start out wanting to be a guy, but after like years of being in a male-dominated industry, she's like, God, it would have been nice though. So her way of combating being in a male-dominated industry her whole life was to just try and join the guys and be like, well, if I could out-burp them, out-raunchy them, out-work them, out-aggressive them,
out-disparage myself them,
they'd have to take me in as them. And she's like, I forgot I wasn't one of the guys, to be honest. And you know who didn't forget that, though? Most of the men. I say there was a couple that treated her well, but it turns out men don't think you're a man just because you're sitting wide-legged.
Yeah, and so she talks about growing up quite shy, but loving to fake interview. And as she got older, she got the bug. She had to learn to get aggressive. She had to learn how to bulldoze her way into an industry that was insanely sexist.
She gets an email when she's in her 30s from her father saying, maybe you may like to carry on the name of Chung, both in Chinese and English, and tell how this Chinese family came to the USA. She is the youngest of 10 children. All of the brothers died as children. So it's an all-female family. Of course, like her older sisters changed their name when they got married. And after her success, her father was like, it would be such an honor if you continue the family name. And she did so for many years proudly. And it wasn't until 2019 when a reporter named Connie Chung contacted me to tell me she discovered that an extraordinary number of Asian parents in the 70s, 80s, and 90s had named their baby daughters Connie after me.
And she realizes her first name will be carried forward as a legacy as well.
She says that it's amazing to be part of this sisterhood. And I think like that is such a profound, beautiful story of and trying to preserve this like patriarchal lineage. What she did was like raise a generation of daughters.
Yeah.
With her name. And I found that very sweet. So that was like a beautiful beginning to this book, a gorgeous preface. And then we get into the story of her parents. And
boy, oh boy.
So interesting. Although I don't know if she kept her reporter hat on for it, to be honest.
Yeah.
So luckily for her, her father wrote like a memoir about his experience leaving China and growing up and raising a family. And so she takes it all. There were times I was like, really? I wonder if reporter Connie Chung would have had a different takeaway than daughter Connie Chung. Anyway, her father and her mother were both raised very wealthy in China, about 120 miles from each other. They were promised to each other in an arranged marriage when they were 12 and 14, although they did not actually get married until they were 17 and 19.
Yes.
In the customary way, when they got married, her mother left her family where, because she was the only daughter, she was incredibly spoiled. Even though boys were preferred, she was a very spoiled little girl who had actually never been taught to read or write because she didn't like to go to school. And her dad was like, well, why would we make her go to school? She's a princess. So she gets sent to her father's house where her new mother-in-law does not like her. She's very pissed that she came with her own handmaid. And they begin this relationship where time after time after time, she's immediately getting pregnant and birthing women.
And so then it makes the dad's family not like her more because she hasn't given them a son. Also, just to say, they were promised to each other at 12 and 14, but they still did not meet until their wedding day. I think that's important.
So they're having children. They're all girls. Everyone's pissed. Of course, she'll be pregnant with a boy and miscarry. She loses a couple boy children right after they're born or in their infancy. Her husband, Connie's father, takes a job in Shanghai as a spy. He just decides to become a spy, which I'm like, is that a real job?
Can you just be a spy?
And can you say that like that?
I guess because he's not a spy anymore.
Also, interestingly enough, she was raised Muslim.
Yeah.
Because of the Silk Road, but that doesn't really come up later at all.
Okay, so she has a lot of compassion for her mom in this relationship. She's like, she had never met this man in her life, and now she's living with him. He doesn't want her there. The mom doesn't want her there. Like, she's just alone in this house.
And he abandons her, moving to Shanghai and becoming a spy and essentially having many mistresses. When she finally goes to visit him at some point, they're all like, but Mrs. Chung is already here. He is hospitalized at one point with a venereal disease. Like, it is tough. She's completely alone with tons of children and grief.
And then one day the dad sees a Chinese family speaking English and dressed in American clothes and looking very
debonair
and goes, we have to get to America.
Then and there, my father told me he plotted out a way to bring his family to the USA to learn to speak English and, as he put it, live happy lives. How lucky then that the very next day, Japan starts a war on their town.
Yeah.
What do you mean you saw a man in jeans and said, should we uproot everything we know and leave? And then very luckily, she said, we got into our little rickshaw and crazy enough, bombs started dropping that second.
I thought her storytelling was so good here. I didn't even think for a second that was weird. I was like, oh, how magical. You escaped.
She does say, she goes, a million things could have gone wrong and almost did, but we made it to America. And it's like the things that went wrong were like, they moved 11 times in a year trying to get to a next city. Because he's a spy, he has inside info about what's getting attacked next. So he's always able to get his family out of town.
And government privileges.
Yeah. So everybody will be put on house arrest. And not him, though, and not his family. At one point, when they finally get out of China, she's like, we got the last 6 seats on an airplane. They did have to pull 6 people off. I'm like, okay, well, those were not actually the last 6 seats had gone to somebody already.
Yeah.
Something was happening here.
As they traveled along the canal, so they had all of their items in one boat and all of the people in another boat, and a bomb blasted all of their belongings.
So they end up escaping to India, where they're like, there's only one place left on the ship to get to America. And the dad's like, I'll go. You guys stay here. It would be safer for the family to be in India, where they don't speak English or Hindi.
Also, because they had a baby, and they were like, you can't bring that baby on the boat.
Yeah, so he said, I'll go.
Yeah.
I'll go alone. You stay here with all the kids.
Yeah.
She was stuck there for 8 months?
Yeah.
She had to sell everything she brought with her to try to eke out enough living to make it. She also, as soon as he left, found out that she was pregnant and had to have an abortion because they could not bring a baby under 2 years onto the boat. So they just would have been stuck in India for even longer. Finally, after 8 months,
they got a seat on another boat and they took a 3-month boat ride to New Jersey.
Her father at the time was working for the Chinese Air Force. He must have been an incredible talker because he wanted to get in the Air Force to get in the US. He didn't know how to pilot anything. So somehow he became the manager of 500 pilots.
Yeah.
I love that you're like, can I get an entry-level job here? No, I'm not qualified. Well, what about the entry-level guys as manager? But hey, he did, and he got him over.
And this journey went from 1937 to 1945. In 1945, they landed at Jersey City Pier in New Jersey.
He's working for the Chinese Air Force with the U.S. government. He's in San Antonio, Texas, and then they transfer him to the Chinese Air Force attaché in Washington, D.C. So in the spring of 1946, my parents and sisters moved to Washington. That's when I, entirely because of their bravery and fortitude across thousands of miles, got to be the beneficiary of that journey, the lucky child born in U.S. soil.
So all of her family was given American names, and then she was born Constance Yu-Hua Chung.
Constance named after some B-list actress from the 40s. I don't know if you guys would know her, Constance Moore.
Yeah, they said they let her sisters flip through magazines to pick what her name would be.
So she has 4 older sisters, and they all have very different personalities. And of course, the oldest one is fully 16 years older than her. So there's a huge age range between all of them. And they begin their journey just trying to make it in the US. Her mother goes from being this incredibly wealthy princess in China, essentially. Not princess literally, but a girl who was raised with many maids to she is now the typical American housewife who is doing all of the laundry by hand, cooking all of the meals. She talks about how her mother would by hand make them the elaborate Chinese meals they're used to at home. And I do wonder how they were able to accomplish that.
With like the spices you have in America?
Yeah, with the lack of ingredients. Because at one point they're living in like Alabama. I'm like, I'm sorry, there just wasn't a H Mart in Alabama. I'm sure of it. Not in the 1950s. Maybe there was. Maybe I have no idea what I'm talking about. But they said it was quite time intensive and she had to take care of 5 kids.
Yeah. The kids were all put in school. They were put well below their grades because none of them spoke English. And then eventually the parents went in for a meeting and they all talked it out and were like, just put them in their grade and see what happens. And within 6 months, all of the sisters were fluent in English.
Her father bops around jobs and they move a lot because of it. He works for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. At one point, he becomes the comptroller at the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel.
Then he starts working over the weekends as an accountant at a hotel. And there are some breaks I feel that they get, although I am like, these seem like pretty reputable jobs. So the fact that he wasn't getting paid well enough to support the family.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a piece missing. Not that I doubt that he was like receiving worse pay because of racism. But it does seem that he always had stable jobs and like second jobs. And then the older sisters all contributed and then they all left. I wonder if he was like gambling or something.
Yeah.
It seems like they are struggling more and more as more children leave the house and more children are contributing to the pot.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I just do wonder because her father was like famously a philanderer. Her mother was miserable the whole time. I don't know. I think that there's like pieces missing. And I think because she was the baby of the family, she was often protected from a lot of it.
I also think there is an interesting way the parents sort of drop out of this book.
Yeah. She reckons with it, but her parents did have like a deeply unhappy marriage in a way that is like kind of unbelievable that they stuck it out when you think about what her mom came from, like the kind of grief that her mom suffered, the fact that she was sent away at 17 to live with people who hated her, were pissed at the children she was bearing.
Then she lost so many children.
Then she was kind of abandoned in India. And now she comes to America where she is like starting from scratch at a socioeconomic level she's never been at before. They never like come together because of it. And so I do wonder if there are pieces that are missing.
I wonder if the reason they kind of fall out of this book is because she just won't discuss it because of honor.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing to say if you're not going to talk about what actually happened.
So he is bopping around. They do end up mostly in Washington, D.C. However, they have like a couple brief stints in Texas and then they move around Washington, D.C. a lot, but they're always in like middle-class white suburbs.
And one thing I really related to her on is the way that she was so shy growing up. And then every time they moved and did a fresh start, she was a little bit less of a wallflower. And I think that that is something so important for some people that no one ever talks about. Sometimes you can't break out of your shell in the same environment. You have to just start over somewhere completely fresh and be like, who can I try to be when no one knows me? It is too scary to do it any other way sometimes.
Her whole family ends up becoming American citizens on June 13th, 1956. Her older sisters are kind of flourishing. It seems like they're doing very well at school and they get good jobs because of it, even in high school, and they're able to contribute to the family. They celebrate their Chinese traditions at home, but they learn about America at school. I feel like they have like a truly bicultural existence. They get along with their neighbors.
One of the sisters works at a department store and gets the family a TV. And Connie loves the news. She loves Walter Cronkite. As her sisters get older, they start getting married, they start moving out, and she writes a very lovely tribute to how proud she is of where they all ended up in their lives.
It was expected that they'd all marry Chinese men, and her 3 older sisters all did. My sisters were with their husbands every step of the way, loyal wives who were instrumental in driving their husbands to professional success. Had they lived in a different era, they could have had spectacular careers of their own. Thanks to my parents, my 4 sisters were strong, ballsy, competitive high achievers who set a high bar for me.
So then as she gets older, it's pretty much just her and her sister, Mamie, in the house. And as she gets older, she starts to realize how much her parents fight.
They also seem to stay a very tight-knit family, even as her sisters grow up to get married, because they all marry men in the military. So they're like often on tours, and the sisters will move back in with the parents to raise their children. So I feel like even though she was the youngest of 5 girls, she didn't have that experience where she grew up feeling like an only child or anything. It seems like there was always her older sisters and her nieces in the home.
Yeah. Her oldest niece is only 10 years younger than her, and they were pretty close. She also knows that her father is really struggling with money. She hears him pleading about like a late bill and is just like, when I'm older, that'll never be me.
And she is slowly coming out of her shell. For 10th grade, I started at my new high school, one of 800 students at Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. Though the school was integrated, the student population was mostly white. After starting small as president of my homeroom in my sophomore year, I won the vice presidency of my junior class. In my senior year, I was elected to a position on the student government legislature. She was like not a stellar student, but I feel like she was very clearly like smart and could do what she wanted. Anything that she wanted to set her mind to, she could accomplish. And what she was interested in was like leading.
Yeah, she would watch Walter Cronkite on CBS Evening News every night, and she loved Nancy Dickerson, the first female reporter at CBS.
We witnessed the Vietnam War on television, the first war Americans experienced on the small screen.
So when they're watching the Vietnam War, some of her classmates and their parents are going to protest the war. And she says that she did not want to protest. She wanted to not participate in the news, but observe it and report it.
So in a weird way, her like shy personality wasn't completely at odds with who she'd grow up to become. She's expressed this throughout this book that she's like, I don't like giving my opinions on things. And writing this memoir was actually hard. She's like, but I like to coax the truth out of people. I like to observe and like ask questions. She ends up going to University of Maryland, which had low tuition and easy admission standards. The running joke in those days was that if you lived in the state, all you needed to get in was a heartbeat.
I will say there is some humbleness in this book, and I know she's coming out of her shell throughout the book and learning to appreciate her abilities. But she goes, now Maryland has transformed into a highly coveted institution, competitive with the best. I certainly would not be able to get in today. You could get into Maryland, Connie.
Can I say something? That is actually like such a thing people love to say.
I know.
Everybody loves to be like, ugh, but today I couldn't get, like people love to be like, I went to a shitty college, but now you couldn't get into my shitty college.
Except for my college. Every memoirist we've read who went to Syracuse is like that dumpster fire. I think we've read like 2 or 3 where they're like, I went to Syracuse, but I'm not stupid, I promise. I didn't think you were.
She lived at home and she commuted. In the first year, she kind of had no sense of what she wanted to do. But importantly, before her first year, they like discover makeup, her and her sister. And I think what she's trying to tell you here with a wink and a nod is like, I became hot, baby. She's like, yeah, we spent a lot of time doing hair and makeup and it was crazy the difference it could make.
I will say, looking at the pictures of her when she was young, I'm like, yeah, smoke show.
You could get it.
She looked so cute.
Part of her persona, which is such an interesting aspect of news specifically, is it's a visual medium. Mm-hmm. You have to have hair done, nails done, everything done, which is crazy because she was sleeping like 1 to 1 hour a day.
Yeah.
Sometimes 1 hour, sometimes 1 hour also.
She was like, if they needed me at 2 a.m., I'd be there.
Especially after having worked until 1 a.m. and then also having to do a 3 a.m. shift. And I'm like, oh, okay, so just no sleep tonight. To have to look good for TV on no hours of sleep. Sometimes I'm getting 12 hours of sleep and I look at myself on a TikTok and I'm like, oof.
Yikes,
back to the drawing board.
The other thing is that she gets even less sleep because she will never go anywhere without makeup on. And so she'll wake up early to like do her own hair and makeup because she doesn't want to even get to the studio without hair and makeup on. They'll put more makeup on her.
So she ultimately breaks out of her shell, though, even in school, of course, and she runs for school legislature. She like had campaign posters that used like Chinese calligraphy type font that said Connie Chung for legislator and plastered them all over campus. I was playing the race card, which was terribly politically incorrect. But in those days, there was no such thing as PC. I do think you're allowed to use your own race.
Yeah.
I do think you're allowed to be like, I am Chinese.
That's so true.
Like, I don't think I would have done it, but I think you can, Connie. Go for it.
Anyway, one day she was touring her friend around DC and she met a Republican congressman.
Seymour Helper, not to name names, who represented Queens in New York.
A liberal Republican. Sorry.
He stopped to introduce himself to us. Frankly, both Carol and I thought it was creepy, but we were courteous when he gave us his card.
And then she ends up working in his office.
He's like, call me if you ever need anything. So she's like, I want a job. I think even he's like, that was crazy that she just called me and asked for a job like that. So he had actually happened to be a former newspaper man, assigned me to write press releases and briefing papers on issues. I watched reporters chasing members of Congress and grilling them with challenging questions.
I could feel the pulse beat of news affecting the actions of politicians and Americans' lives. This was the world in which I wanted to live. I wanted to be a journalist. So she changes her major and has to do an extra year of school because she was originally in like biology and then she switched to accounting and now she was going to do journalism.
She then talks about in the 1960s, she was sexually molested by her trusted family doctor who actually had delivered her. And she tells this story and she's like, I never really want to come out with this, but when the Me Too movement broke, I felt the need to contribute my voice. And she said it was really difficult because my whole life I had like staked my journalistic integrity on never being a part of the story. Like that's like rule number 1. But finally, through husband Maury Povich's,
encouragement,
She writes a story about how she was molested by her doctor. And when she put it out there, and she's in her 70s at this point, her own sister called her and goes, oh my God, that happened to me too. And she talks about it. She had written it along the time that
when people were protesting Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court, which he ultimately was confirmed.
Since I was no longer working in the news business, I felt free to even call the senators who were still wavering on which way they would vote. You know what happened. Kavanaugh was ultimately confirmed to a lifetime appointment in the highest court of the nation.
She does realize the importance of sharing these stories because she realizes if her sister had told her story, it might not have happened to her. If she had told her story, you don't know how many people came after her.
Yeah, even though I think for her, it was deeply uncomfortable to like cross this line of journalism and go from like interviewer to interviewee, she felt that it was really important to join the conversation. And she saw the impact that she had by sharing her story and how many people reached out to her. And I think she like really is happy that she did it.
Yeah, and I think her open letter to Christine Blasey Ford is very beautiful.
Beat the June crunch. That's what a journalism professor told me the semester before I graduated from Maryland.
It's really good advice.
So basically, he said to her, get an internship the last semester of college so that you already have a foot in the door when you're competing with all the other college graduates for a job. Even though I do think that is good advice, I do think things were so different back in the day.
Yeah, because no one else was even doing that. Now it's like if you don't have an internship your last semester, I guess like what's the point of even graduating?
Yeah, I mean, I know I've seen other people talk about it, and I wonder if it's more prevalent in journalism almost than other industries too. And I'm so happy she made it, of course, but the way that she literally just like walked into a bunch of offices was like, can I have a job here, please? And she even said, she goes, if you tried to walk into CNN today, they would arrest you. But back then, she just like walked into all the major news outlets, and she's in DC. So these are like not just some small town local news. These are like national news outlets. And she walked in and was like, can I talk to the manager, please? I would like a job. And you know what? By golly, she fucking got one.
Yeah, so the first place she walked in said no.
And then the second place she walked in, they're like, well, you'll never make it here. Your tape is awful. You're terrible at this job, but we'll let you do the night shift. And then the guy from her first job, I think his name is Mike Buchanan, calls her back up and goes, guess what? Everybody here is chanting to give you the job. They're rooting for you. And she's like, I don't know what I did or even said in front of the group that made them root for me, but she immediately quit her nighttime job and walked her ass over. And now she has a job at WTTG TV Channel 5.
Mike Buchanan turned out to be the perfect mentor. So she at first is kind of a gopher, which means as news comes in off the wire, she rips it off the typewriter and brings it to whatever department it's necessary at, or pins it to the wall under the category if it's like not that pressing. And at the time, the anchors of their 10 o'clock news show are Alan Smith, John Willis, and Maury Povich.
He was well-known and popular, son of legendary Washington Post sports columnist Shirley Povich, who was revered in the nation's capital.
Can I tell you something? It was not until many, many chapters later
that Shirley was his dad, not his mom.
Yeah, I was like, wow, how inspiring that Maury Povich had such an impressive mom.
Yeah. It turns out actually the joke is specifically that the mom always gets left out of any write-ups about the family.
LOL.
I will say he has a very impressive sister, which is cool.
Yeah.
You can't get a mom, you'll take a sister.
Congratulations, Lynn. Viewers loved Maury's unpredictability and mischievousness.
He never really acknowledged her. He was married with 2 babies at the time, but that was fine. She was busy. She was 22 and working hard. I guess maybe 23, but still.
When I graduated from Maryland in June, the only job Mike Buchanan offered me was a newsroom secretary, because that was one of the jobs women could have.
That's the way it was in those days. Men were not relegated to secretarial duties. It was women's work, commonly called pink-collar jobs. I took the offer anyway, confident I could parlay this nothing job into something better. And boy, did she. I mean, she was making opportunities. I don't even say she took every opportunity. There was one lazy reporter who hated to have to go out and do reports. And so one time she said, okay, why don't you man my boring desk and I'll do your job? And he said, that's fine. And she ended up writing the script for the news that night. And everybody was like, okay, that really wasn't like your call to make.
But you did do a good job.
So then she like uses that and parlays herself up into being a writer. When Mike allowed me to become a writer, it paved the way for the next step to reporter.
Also, wait, can I say one thing? When she became a writer, they were like, well, then who's going to be the secretary? So she like went to the bank
across the street
and was like, would you be the secretary over at the news station? And this woman was like, yeah, okay.
Later, that woman, Tony, rose up to become a producer. So there you go. Take women with you.
Yes.
When Mike allowed me to become a writer, it paved the way for the next step to reporter. I kept nagging him to promote me. He gave me a few tryouts on the 10 o'clock news, and only after a few months of writing, he relented. I will say at this point, she is now only 2 years in the business with a television contract to be a reporter, an on-air reporter. She was thrilled.
And she's working so hard. I learned the art of marrying words to pictures. TV reporters do not need to describe what the viewer is seeing. but some reporters left producers to make the visual choices for them. Not me. I was obsessed with sitting beside the editor and producer, choosing sound bites and shots, even down to how many frames and whether to dissolve a cut from one shot to the next.
She began covering stories all over DC, sometimes working 6 days a week and always on Saturdays. If anybody was out sick, she would take their job. I mean, she was running. She was up as early as she could. Anything, any scrap on the table, she would go. She would keep anybody's seat warm just for the hope that something interesting could happen.
Because the problem is, as a female reporter, she was often given the fluff pieces. She was always given some fashion beat, the story of shrinking hemlines or whatever the hell. And so she was always saying like, okay, if I have to do this story, then I will find a good story too. So anytime anything came up, she would be on the beat hoping to get a better story.
She is also coming up concurrently with the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964. So there was a push around America and in newsrooms to try to like bring on diversity. There was like a liberal awareness that we need to be hiring women, we need to be hiring people of color. But of course, back then it wasn't like many. It was like hire a woman and one black man, and then everybody felt like they had covered their ass. But there were like conversations happening. And at 25, she's quoted in a National Newsweek article called New Crop of Female News Reporters. She says, "I hate fashion stories. Give me a tear gas, rock throwing riot anytime." Lots of this book is dedicated to describing her contemporaries, the other women coming up in newsrooms around the country. And I think it's also a story of like how women, when they're put in this dog-eat-dog situation where only one gets to level up, how do they act around each other? Do they make each other competition or do they lift each other up?
And boy, does it vary.
There's a spectrum.
So then she's chasing a story and she barges into a restaurant to try to get a scoop. And just coincidentally, in that restaurant is the CBS News Washington Bureau's chief, Bill Small, and he calls to hire her pretty quickly. And so now she's over at CBS.
Yeah, he was really impressed by her like gumption and chutzpah. And so my wildest dreams turned to a reality. That's next. On October 1st, 1971, I jumped into an ocean having barely learned to tread water. I'd been in the news business all of 2 years and on air as a reporter for only one of them. Yet I was hired by CBS News, the most prestigious nationwide television network, led by the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, the television anchorman I worshipped.
So then she kind of gives a background on the way the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission paved the way for her to get this role. So her future sister-in-law, Lynn Povich, was actually one of the people that pioneered this revolution by using that act to sue their workplaces for not promoting women. And her work on this topic led to the book that she later wrote called Good Girls Revolt, which then is a TV show.
She says one of the problems with like the pushing of hiring women and stuff is that there will be like a wave and then they'll hire a bunch and then they'll go, okay, we're good. And she says, it wasn't a full decade later that CBS hired a new wave of female on-air reporters. For me, every day was a test. Did I measure up? My being a woman was a bigger challenge than my race. I wanted to be accepted and treated just like my male colleagues when we all covered the male-dominated world of politics at the White House. Everywhere I looked, there were men. Since I wanted to fit in, I became one of them. In my mind, I could walk like them, talk like them, and be as tough as them. Why should I perceive myself any differently? It's so funny. She talks about all the little problems. I will say, I think she must have been fucking tough as nails and funny as hell because it seems like in small scenarios where she had enough time for people to get to know her, she could
win anybody over.
She would humiliate men. She would throw down. She could be quicker, faster to the punchline than anybody else. She says people would make the mistakes once or twice of telling her what to wear and then never make that mistake again. I would not have taken it to it kindly, yet it was common for viewers to scrutinize a woman's appearance on the air while men were allowed to be bald, fat, and ugly.
So she is a little baby reporter at CBS, which the baby reporters, she calls them cubs, had no comforts.
There's a real seniority in a newsroom. So basically, like, if you get a scoop, you have to hand it to the guy above you. It's called like Bigfooting. Of course, the problem is women never really get to become the Bigfoot. So like they're forced giving all of their scoops to the male anchor who laps them. But when you're young, it is just like par for the course. She gives a lot of credit to Walter Cronkite, however, which I think many older Americans will be happy to hear. He is somebody who gave her a lot of opportunities, let her get on air early. And every time she wrote a good story, he would like hand write her a thank you note saying, great work today. And I really do think it goes to show like that's how you become a fucking good leader.
Yeah. And those little attaboys like are what propelled her forward. Whenever someone who was hugely important told her good job, it was like the little button that she needed to keep going. So then she writes a little bit more about her sassy ways to keep up with the boys club. She says that when she was good, she was so good. She was always falling in line with her superiors.
Well, I think from a workhorse
perspective,
nobody could outwork her. There's nothing she said no to. I mean, more than not saying no to anything, she was like saying yes to things no one had even thought of to ask yet.
Yeah, but when she was sassin', she was sassin'.
She said, I was faster, better, and funnier than they could. It worked. They would not mess with me when I was willing to offend first, then laugh it off.
It makes me sad that she had to offend herself a lot.
She said, never would I run to the ladies' room crying and shaking. A toughie. I determined there was no crying in news. Just the way years later, Tom Hanks shouted at his all-female team in a league of their own, there is no crying in baseball.
My dad used to say that to me when I would cry growing up.
And now I'm paying the price. Now I'm like, please stop crying.
They're all clogged up in here still waiting to come out.
Maybe someone can figure out if being the only Asian reporter was a help or a hindrance. I still don't know. There was no doubt that the racism I experienced was as reprehensible as the sexism.
So there were a couple moments when her network's racism was pretty called out. When President Nixon went on a trip to China, she was not chosen to cover it. And other reporters reported on the fact that CBS News did not send their one Chinese American reporter to cover
who
this
speaks
story.
Chinese fluently, like their bilingual reporter.
Yeah. So she's also spending all of her time hunting for stories, but also developing relationships. She develops relationships with members of Congress who are later going to go on to be incredible scoops.
But she also feels frustrated, like she's often reduced, she is often reduced to like the ladies' work. So cover Mrs. Nixon at her brunch. And she said the problem was she was so good at her job that she would figure out tough questions to ask Mrs. Nixon, who would return with pithy sound bites. My reward, I was sent to cover her again and again. So because she could kind of turn something out of nothing, they kept giving her the ladies' nothings. You know, she was covering the Nixon office when the great ping pong diplomacy went down. And even though she wasn't able to cover it, it of course did affect her life because one of the things her parents had to give up when they became American citizens was any and all contact with family in China who were living under communist rule. So when the president succeeded in normalizing relations, they finally could write to relatives. My parents did not know who was still alive. Letters flowed again, but my parents kept what they discovered to themselves, probably because none of it was good news.
She finally is assigned in 1972 to a presidential campaign for George McGovern of South Dakota.
Who they give her thinking that he's going to be the first to drop out. He's not even the Democratic nominee at this point. So they're like, well, he's not going to make it to the actual presidency. So they think they've dudded her, but what they did was set her up for success, baby, because she spent the next year in the press pool.
Yeah.
In the press pool plane.
I mean, she spent an entire year living out of a carry-on suitcase, something that I cannot even do for one full day. And like just going from city to city, following McGovern on the campaign trail and, you know, being a part of this gang of reporters that's following him around. She has one story about like talking to her boyfriend on the phone and two other reporters come running up to the phone booth to try to talk to her about something and she yanked their flies down.
She thinks they're like sexually harassing her, so she yanks their flies down and walks away to humiliate them. And then something very funny and reportedly about her is she did so much research for this memoir.
Yeah.
So she like read the memoirs and books and articles of anybody else. She like interviewed other people who had ever known her. And she found out in doing research for this book that the reason they were banging on her payphone booth was because they thought she was getting another scoop because she was known to work earlier and later than everybody. And they were like, oh, we can't lose another one to Connie. So they were trying to like distract her. And she was like, I guess I underestimated my talent and overestimated my sexiness. There is a part of this, like, of course I had to fend for myself, but once I got their respect, we all like laughed and joked and we had a good time. Like it was definitely not what would fly in today's woke culture. But, you know, she held her own and she was respected as one of the guys. Like she was the one that people turned to when they needed like good background info because she was
doing all the research.
Anybody who knew anything knew she was the best or one of the best.
Okay, so another thing she was doing is because she was wanting to be so on, she would wake up earlier than everyone else and work later than everyone else. But when they went to the bar, she would go to get a good night's sleep so that she could wake up fresh, ready to go. And then she found out that at the bar, people are trading scoops and getting inside information. So then she goes, well, I have to drink and stay out late with everybody else too. So then she's waking up earlier than everyone, working later than everyone, and then still going to the bar afterwards to party just in case there is like some leaked information.
Just in case somebody gets too drunk and spills. The truth is that the hazing probably worked to challenge me into clearing the high bar Small had set for me. I put my nose to the grindstone, demanded excellence of myself. Those formative years laid a foundation for me, one in which I learned how to be a journalist from the CBS Masters of the Craft, covering important, serious, and significant national and international news. I knew the good girl could succeed as long as I could curb the enthusiasm of the sassy one. I don't know if that's true.
At one point, McGovern also tries to kiss her, and it's important, I feel like, to call out
Yeah. And then she says a lot of people said things to her and like made innuendo or like came on to her. But if she shut it down, nothing happened. She said only 2 men ever actually like made physical passes at her.
And it was McGovern and Jimmy Carter.
Which is tough to hear. Why is he still alive?
Get out of here, man. Get out of here while it's still good. So she never moved out of her parents' house because she was still working in Washington. She's 26. She's on the campaign trail. She has a full-time job as a on-air reporter. For a while, every payday, she was giving part of her check to her parents. And then when her dad suffered a heart attack and retired, she was just fully taking care of her parents as the breadwinner of the house.
She also was, of course, hungry to move up and couldn't believe that she like wasn't being treated like a veteran. And she says, today I'm amazed that I have the audacity to believe I deserved equality with the veterans when I had been at CBS less than a year. Oops. And like she got in trouble for the Bigfooting thing. Instead of taking her scoops and giving them the more senior reporters, she tried to sell it to a different CBS news show and being like, can I come and report this on your show? And they were like, you really can't do that. Like you work for a show. I was thinking a lot about like the foreshortening of youth and the way that when you're like 25 and you look at a 45-year-old, you're like, what's the difference between us? I've been doing this for 3 years now. What else is there to like, what more could they know than me? And then like you're like 30 and you look back and you go, why did I fucking think I knew a thing at 25?
Fucked up.
Like, but there is this thing when you're looking forwards, you're like, what's the difference? 25, 45, what else is there to learn? And then like looking back, you're like, you have no idea how young and stupid you are.
Yeah. I will say she is so good and so persistent too.
No, she had to be hungry.
But this story was crazy. Everyone is on the beat of trying to figure out who McGovern is going to pick for his VP. So they're all like following and stalking and obsessing over it. She later finds out from someone who was in one of the cars with the Secret Service that they were specifically like, if Connie Chung is anywhere near us, lay on the ground. We cannot get caught by Connie Chung specifically.
I mean, because she had been given such dud roles, she got really good at like forcing a mic in front of someone's face and getting a soundbite. The other thing about her is, in addition to being so hungry and ambitious and always like asking for bigger roles, she was deeply respectful and like an admiration of those above her. She talks about writing with Mary McGorry, who she like respected to no end, and watching her work into the early hours of the campaign press room. I didn't dare bother her. There out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of her writing process. I yearned to look over her shoulder and ask what she was thinking, but I had the good sense not to interrupt her. Like she is in deep admiration and respect of people that have come before her and proven themselves, but she also is like hungry for more and she will not be made to be stagnant. This is my favorite story in the book. She's trying to figure out who
the VP is.
The VP pick is going to be, and she finally gets the scoop after like hounding them down all night and going to their friends' houses and like tracking these people down. And so she gets the scoop. She's on CBS Morning News. Her mom calls her and goes, I'm mighty proud, but you look tired. But I noted you could only see my hand holding the mic. The rest of my report was a voiceover. As only a mother could, she replied, your hand looked tired.
She's trying to pay rent for the whole family right now.
Well, get some sleep.
So then Watergate breaks and she's kind of a part of covering it, but there are other like primary reporters.
And she is like, we just couldn't keep up with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. She's like, we just, like everyone was in awe of it from journalism. And something very interesting is because they're getting all these secondary sources, because they can't keep up with the main story that's breaking, newsrooms are fighting to get the scraps. And of course, the fighting is getting competitive and people are not maintaining maybe their journalistic integrity. But her boss, knowing the presidency was at stake, Small was adamant that no one he oversaw would make a mistake. Small established strict standards. If information came from an unnamed source, we must have at least 2 solid first-person sources, meaning 2, not just 1, reliable people who had firsthand knowledge of what had happened. If we had a third person confirming this information, that person could be a secondhand source. We could not run with any story without fully verifying every part of it. And it's just like crazy to see the difference that even that, like, you know, you have this incredible story breaking. I'm sure they were desperate from a business and professional standpoint to get a piece of it. But that like the leader of the room was holding strong to the standards and integrity to make sure nothing was wrong because there were like something important at stake. It's just kind of unfathomable how in 40 years we've completely veered from that there is like no care from the major reporters. You know what I mean? Like the biggest news sources could not give a damn.
I mean, it's hard because the biggest news sources have been scooped by people with no higher structure.
I mean, like Fox is not up there being like, did we double check this 3 times?
No, they're not. They've not even double checked it once.
They didn't even check it. They kind of just said it. And they said, that'll get people pissed. Run with that.
At one point, she gets an exclusive with Nixon when she's trying to get in to report on the trial. And she just like kind of sees him standing in a driveway at the White House.
And so she doesn't even take out her notebook because she's like, I can't lose this by like losing a second. And she asks him questions. She can't remember what she asked him, but he turned and said, how much do you make? And she started explaining how much she made. And he goes, you need to make way more than that.
Thanks, President Nixon.
That's the economic plan. Whoa, you're going to need to make some more money. Take it from me, the president. That's not a lot of money.
Support for this show comes from Amazon Prime. Everyone has their special holiday traditions, the little things that make it feel like truly the holidays to you. Whether it is a scent, you've got to have that candle lit. There's a fun piece of decor that you've got to get up. With Amazon Prime, you can get that holiday feeling with fast, free delivery on holiday essentials. Claire, what are your holiday essentials?
I'm a big decor girl.
Okay.
And I'm starting my own collection as like a newly married person. And it's a lot. It's crazy to me how much bows and whistles and ornaments you need. And just knowing that I have a lifetime to stock up, I am like, okay, there's time. But this year I'm so excited to get new ornaments. I'm also a big eggnog person. We make eggnog every year.
I love a nog.
But isn't it good? Homemade.
It's a good nog.
I feel like eggnog gets a bad rap out there, but a homemade eggnog is like one of the great desserts on earth.
That's so true. For me, Christmas cheer, because I'm not a big decor girl, but I like a candle. I love a scent. I like to have a warm, cozy chestnuts roasting on an open fire energy throughout my home. The other thing that's very important to me is Christmas cheer for my daughter.
Bug, Anne.
Yeah, and I love putting her in like a doggy Christmas sweater. I got her reindeer antlers. She doesn't love any of it, but it makes me feel happy, and that's our tradition.
That's how she gives back.
Yeah. You know where else you can find Christmas cheer? Amazon Music has all of the holiday tunes that your heart is dying to sing.
I cannot wait to curl up on the couch with movies from Amazon Prime Video. I love a holiday film.
Whatever you're into this holiday season, from streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into. She gets to go on some good trips to report on things.
But as always, she's the only woman anywhere. That's not true, but she's definitely one of very few, often the only woman in the room, and always the only Asian woman.
Yeah.
She has this moment, I guess some photo of her went very viral, and all these women were being like, wow, that's today. I feel just like her. I totally get it. I know what it's like to be the only woman in the room. And she goes, my worst fears about today's workplaces were realized. I felt sad for the lack of progress, but extremely happy for the camaraderie. One thing about this book is she starts out so young and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and hopeful, and things are happening and she's making her way up, and 2 years in she gets her dream job and she's fighting for more and she's given scraps and making hearty meals, and by the end, oh boy, do I have less hope than the beginning.
It's just so hard because she becomes so successful and it never gets easier.
It's hard to read about a woman born like right after World War II and be like, and 60 years later she realized it was worse than she had thought.
So she becomes the first woman to cover a vice president, and she's put on the Rockefeller beat. John D. Rockefeller Sr., who was the vice president. The training wheels I'd worn over the years at CBS were off. I appeared on Cronkite's News and CBS Morning News, and I earned the trust of experienced political reporters like Lou Cannon of the Los Angeles Times.
So she is now getting stories like across the CBS docket. She's on CBS Evening News. She is becoming very well known, and she's slowly getting hired as like the stand-in for when someone gets sick, and like slowly but slowly she's cobbling together quite an impressive resume.
Yeah. And she's also just so reliable and so good at what she does.
Dan Rather, who is an anchor, she does like a great job, and so she goes to hand him the research and he goes, well, step right up here. I'm about to go back on air. You tell him what you found. Surprised, I stepped up on the platform and stood next to the White House correspondent. Dan looked in the camera and said, CBS News reporter Connie Chung just ran into the White House aide Steve Bull, who has been with the president. Connie, what did he tell you?
It was the first and only time anything nice about Dan Rather happened in this book.
Yeah.
Fuck that guy, huh? So she's having a bit of a crisis of not being inspired anymore after covering McGovern, Watergate, and Rockefeller, who she calls Rocky. She just wasn't that excited about any of the things she was being offered to cover. But then she gets offered to anchor the local news in Los Angeles.
And so there's kind of a back and forth. Of course, you're supposed to go from local news to national news, but because she had started in DC, she started at national news. She said one reason to go local was that I would be getting more anchoring experience. By 1976, I had been a substitute anchor on the CBS Morning News. Often I co-anchored with either CBS News' Morton Dean, but in those days, no one watched CBS Morning News. If anybody was up and wanted to watch news, they watched Barbara Walters on the Today Show. She takes the job because it also has a lot more money. She goes from making $23,000 a year to like $100,000 a year.
And then the other thing is she has been living in DC with her parents this entire time, and she doesn't feel that she could just get an apartment. She needs to be like, well, for work, I have to move across the country.
She felt like she was the only one, not only fiscally responsible for them, but emotionally responsible for them. I guess they were very unhappy, understandably so. But they like were always complaining to her, and she had to become like the referee. She said the minute her dad had that heart attack when she was like 23, she became the parent and they became the children, and she just couldn't take it anymore. So she moves away and she takes the job.
Flying to California, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Rebellion at age 29 seemed a bit ludicrous, but better late than never. So now she's paying for her parents' bills and for her own bills and still saving a lot because she's making a ton of money.
She has a really interesting experience on the local news. She says it's so different than what she's used to. Doing the 6 o'clock national news is very like tight and intense, and you're with people in their living room. But when you're doing the 11 o'clock news, you're with people in their bed. And she says they feel very intimate with you. It has to be much more casual. They were trying to figure out this new kind of like chit chat way of talking. It was so interesting. Much what the internet did to like TV news was now doing to newspapers. So it was like a huge boom. There was a huge opportunity. They were trying to find the way to make it conversational and chatty. But she had like a really fun schedule. She'd get there at 2 p.m. They'd go on at 11. They'd all go out to eat dinner at midnight. And then she'd go home and go to bed and like sleep.
Well, I think she's doing the 5 o'clock news also. So she's doing the 5 o'clock and the 11 o'clock.
But she becomes kind of a local legend.
Everyone in town loves her. I mean, it's LA. So she gets a lot of, fancy friends.
It also takes them a really long time to find who a good co-anchor is. It's so interesting watching them try to like finagle chemistry and how to balance out two people. She, though, is the constant. They're like finding who can go with her.
Even Maury, her eventual husband, becomes her co-anchor briefly, but the executive who hired him was fired shortly after. And so then the new executive who came in also got rid of Maury.
From the moment I arrived at Channel 2, I declared I could not just show up and read the news as some lazy anchors did. My goal was to continue to burnish my reputation as a serious political reporter. So she's like hustling and getting good stories and working really hard. And she says they remember her. She like shows up at a Nixon golf tournament and his aide goes, "It's nice to see you again, Connie," as they're like whisking her away from the president because they know that she is
cuckoo.
A rascal with a mic.
She definitely butts heads with some people. There's a lot of racism and misogyny, even though she is the anchor.
She also is like cracking cases that get her in trouble. She comes after Synanon, I think it's called, and she needs like a bodyguard. Like she gets a couple cases where people are like, "I will fucking kill you, Connie Chung." And they're like, "Okay."
Oops.
The bright California sun was shining on me every day, and I thanked my lucky stars that I was enjoying my work and was secure with my new contract. Then my parents called. With excitement in their voices, they informed me they were moving to Los Angeles to be with me.
So that sucked.
She's really upset, but nevertheless, she doesn't know how to get out of it, so she buys them a house in Van Nuys, which I think is like an hour away probably from where she lives. No.
I mean, I guess it depends on traffic, but I think back then it wouldn't have been that bad.
She would have dinner with them every Sunday, and they would come meet her for lunch every Wednesday and then call her nonstop. And then they demand to have a house in Beverly Hills. And she's like, "I can't believe other people get to have fun and I'm like trapped taking care of my parents." She never really gets into her relationship with her other sisters, but she does say it takes a toll on her family and her relationship with her sisters that her parents then also are always saying like, "Oh, only Connie cares about us. Only Connie loves us. Only Connie does what she's supposed to." She is surprised that her Chinese sisters don't take on more familial responsibilities since that's a big part of their culture. But it sounds like she did not stay close to them. And there's a lot of factors at play. And most of them were from her mom and dad. She does, however, also start dating Maury. She says at about the same time that her parents moved and were kind of fucking up her life, Maury was fired from Channel 2 and his marriage ended in divorce. She was like, "We were both pretty down and out and we consoled in each other." They started a long distance romance that was like not exclusive. They just like would date each other here and there for the next 7 years.
Yeah. So he got a new job in San Francisco pretty quickly. And so then he was up there. In LA, she had met Warren Beatty on the campaign trail and he was flirting with her a lot, but she wasn't about to fuck up on the campaign trail. But now that she was in LA, she's like, "I guess I'll start dating Warren Beatty a little."
He's obsessed with her. She says one time Maury's daughters were at her apartment, picked up the phone, and when they found out it was Warren Beatty, they were like, "Oh my God, that's so cool. We won't blow your cover." So they would like code word be like, "Oh, it's Walter on the phone," and like fully help Connie keep a double life. That's so funny.
At one point, she hooks up with Glenn Fry from the Eagles.
And Maury's like, "You're a star fucker." And she's like, "Well, that's better than fucking girls whose names you don't know at all."
This part is so crazy. This guy was drunk and he's like, I'm in a band. And she was like, okay, play something from your band. And he gets on the piano and plays Hotel California.
She also hooks up with Ryan O'Neal because they're at a dinner party together and like they never even speak, but she has a huge crush on him. And she like wants to get in his line of sight so she can start a conversation, but it never happens all night. And then on their way out, they're at the door at the same time and she just looks up at him and goes, your place or mine? And O'Neal goes, up to you. And she goes, okay, follow me.
It was crazy.
Connie, the game on that girl. Oh my God. I like cannot believe what a cool badass Connie Chung is.
She's so cool.
The 7 years I spent in Los Angeles were the halcyon days of my single life, during which I made lifetime friends, but soon all those friends started leaving for the Big Apple one by one. The thing is, like, a lot of people in LA, I guess, were beautiful. So then they used the local LA news to find out which of those beauties were talented. And then they'd all send them to New York where the real news was.
Professionally, I'd become too comfortable and did not feel challenged anymore. I needed to be scared again. So then she writes a little tribute to Maury.
She says, before I take you to my next job in New York, I must pause for a commercial about my husband. She definitely like razzes on him a lot.
Yeah, but they've been married for a really long time.
For almost 40 years, yeah. But she's like not warm and fluffy. She's like, let me tell you about him. He's messy. He's hasty, but she respects him. And she says, like, I couldn't have gotten through my career without him. I think it was really helpful for her to have somebody in her corner, on her side. What seems like one of Maury's strengths is that he doesn't really need respect from anyone but himself. He's like, I don't care about my reputation. I know what I'm capable of and I know what I've accomplished and you should too. They can't take anything from you. If they say you're a bad reporter, you know that that's not true. And I think that that has been really helpful for her.
Also because he knew the business so well, it was, I think, really helpful for her to have someone in her corner that she respected.
And comes from this family of like soundboards.
I mean, the business was going to try to take advantage of her as a Chinese American woman. And so the fact that she could go talk to people who understood what she should be asking for was, I think, very helpful.
So they end up getting married before they even live in the same city. They make it sound like, well, she found a pretty dress and she's like, okay, we could get married now. She said it was very like, sometimes she was ready and he wasn't, and then he'd be ready and she wasn't. And then suddenly she was like 38 and she was like, okay, I wasn't too young to get married anymore. And they did it. She said at her wedding, her parents showed up and pretended to be sick and like cried the whole time. And then his daughters cried the whole time. And they were just like, okay, happy marriage. Let's get this thing over with.
So in 1983, she moves to New York to be at NBC.
She said there was crazy speculation about where she was about to go.
Yeah.
She had a clause in her contract that said she still had another year at that local TV station unless she got another offer, which like, then what is a contract?
Yeah.
Like, what was that contract protecting?
I guess she couldn't just quit randomly.
They were like, one thing about you is we got to keep you on the air for us or for someone else, but we can't get enough of that Connie.
NBC News offered me everything I wanted except the salary. I took a pay cut because I felt the NBC job had the most promise.
This is also the era where like morning news is becoming quite an important part of the newscape. Formerly, everybody wanted the prestige of nighttime news, but then they did the math and it turns out a half-hour show sells less ads than 2-hour shows. And with Barbara Walters on the Today Show and like that competition, which we definitely heard about like in the Katie Couric book, I feel like it comes up a lot.
Yeah.
I think we've definitely read about it a few times.
So the Today Show with Brian Gumbel and Jane Pauley is not doing great behind Good Morning America. So she pitches an early morning show to come in before the Today Show and then have like more on the docket in the morning so that people are more likely to tune in to NBC. And it kind of works.
She gets to do a 1-minute news update on the 6 o'clock news show. So what she does is she wakes up at 2 a.m. She spends 1 hour getting her hair and makeup done. At 3, they pick her up. She does the 6 o'clock news. She goes home, takes a nap, and then she wakes up at 5:30, has dinner, and then goes back to the studio to do 1 minute of news. And then she goes back home and takes another 3-hour nap. And she goes, believe it or not, sleeping in 2 3-hour shifts was, to say the least, difficult. She's like 40 at this point. That's what like blows my mind.
Yeah.
It'd be one thing to do it for 6 months when you're 19. I guess like new parents have to do it for a little bit, but like the whole thing is they're like, you're so delirious, you can't even go to work. I had a few scares. In the dead of winter, 5:30 in the late afternoon looks exactly like 5:30 in the morning. I would panic and freak out. Was it AM or PM? If it was 5:30 AM, I was cooked.
That happens to me and I don't even have to be anywhere ever.
Sometimes I just look up and I forget what I've been doing.
I go AM or PM.
I look up and I go, have I been asleep or dead awake? I don't know the difference sometimes. Oh my God. So then in addition to the 6 a.m., she became like the fill-in girl for the Today Show. So sometimes they would call her at 2 a.m. and be like, by the way, can you work a double? So she would wake up at 2 a.m., work straight from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., get to sleep for 3 hours, and then come back and do more news.
This show is not boosting ratings in the way that they hoped it would. But then she finds out it's because it's not on every NBC affiliate network. And so she starts like going to the affiliate networks and being like, play my show. And it boosts ratings. Then they're number one.
I love that. I mean, she really will just like outwork anybody. And then because her show does so well, their morning show does better. And they have to hand it to her. They said, you did this. We hoped you would turn it around. I don't think they believed that she could, but she did.
They are always pitting her against Jane Pauley, being like, Connie Chung is gunning for Jane Pauley's position. She just isn't.
And worse than that is the way that Jane Pauley is treated on that show. And I think we heard about it a bit in Katie Couric's memoir. But like that guy, what's his name? Bryant Gumbel?
Yeah.
Fuck that guy. He had such a iron grasp around
those hoes at the network.
He had the right contractually to speak first. He would not give it up. They really were shitty on set. They wouldn't acknowledge their female co-hosts before they were on air. And when Connie was there, she kind of couldn't believe the way she was being treated. And when she fought back, she lost. And then she was like, God, I hope they're not that awful to Jane. But I think they were.
They were.
She actually had to apologize to Bryant for like being shitty to her.
So then Maury moves to New York and they're living together for the first time. It's crazy.
They were worried, but it worked out.
So she's getting reduced at work.
And it's tough because these are stories that her male counterparts will not do because they're like, it's beneath us. She's forced to do it. And it does, in fact, affect her reputation. Then oftentimes as TV starts having to get more like ratings focused and entertainment-y, they will like take on something, for example, the OJ trial that they had all refused to do earlier. And of course, their reputations aren't hurt when the entire news organization is doing it, but it does stick to her.
Another thing that I don't think was obvious to me in one of the other obstacles in female reporting is that when she gets a scoop and reports negatively on a man, if they fight back on it, her reputation can get hurt.
Yeah, she's often called a bitch for
getting a story. So she interviews Bobby Knight from Indiana University's basketball team. He's their legendary coach. He is like known for being temperamental. I asked Bobby how he handled the stress. On tape, Knight said, I think if rape is inevitable, relax and enjoy it. Obviously, I was taken aback. Knight realized what he had just said and followed with, that's just an old term that you're going to use. The plane's going down, so you have no control over it. I'm not talking about the act of rape. Don't misinterpret me there. But what I'm talking about is if something happened to you, you have to handle it.
It's also ironic because he's being interviewed as somebody who cannot control his temper.
Yeah.
So this idea that he's like, just lean in and go for the ride. When?
So she says, we aired it, but I used his explanation and the context. He got in huge trouble.
As he should have.
People said it was coarse language, poor taste. Student protesters demanded an apology. Years later, Roy Firestone asked Knight, what do you think of Connie Chung? Knight said, if Connie Chung was on fire, I wouldn't even piss on her. I actually remember this quote, and I do feel like it's so insane that he is mad at her for the thing he said. And that happens over and over again in this book where someone will say something to her.
And they'll be like, how dare you use it? I only said that to you with cameras on. That wasn't permissible.
It's so
I didn't
crazy.
know you'd make me look bad.
Men are so evil. I'm sorry. You know that tweet, that viral tweet that's like men should be born in jail and have to prove their way out? Why not?
Well, it's so funny because then she talks about Gary Hart, who actually we just talked about on the Patreon. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Gary Hart, he's everywhere, who taunted reporters saying, if you think I'm a philanderer, come and catch me. They immediately caught him. It completely like grounded his presidential run to a halt. And she says, that revelation changed how reporters dealt with dalliances by public figures. For years, White House reporters had kept quiet about presidents who cheated on their first ladies. After the Hart revelation, all bets were off.
So then she finds out that at NBC, all of the producers hate her for being difficult.
And of course, what's difficult about her is that they keep taking away her credibility because it is happening. Like she is getting criticized by the press as like the fun floppy girl, not floppy, but like, you know what I mean? She's doing floof stories. They call her Connie Fun.
Yeah.
Because she only does like puff pieces. So she goes to them to be like, I don't know what to do. I can't work here anymore. And their responses, well, actually, nobody wants to work with you. And it's your job to have meetings with each of the producers and find out why they hate you. And she's like, I can't even remember what they said. I just remember being fucking humiliated, having to like essentially grovel for feedback.
But then CBS makes her an offer she can't refuse. And by she can't refuse, she means she wants to get the fuck out of NBC. And then her kind of home network, CBS, comes calling.
The misogyny of news is so interesting because when we think about like the importance of journalism in society, it's this idea that they're going to shed light on the truth and uncover injustices and stuff. Like I think there is this like noble idea behind it, that it's this calling that you like want to make the world a better place by like giving voice to the voiceless and uncovering the truth and holding power accountable.
But like men protect each other ultimately.
But it's just so interesting that these like people that you think are like bringing us into the next generation are so fucking misogynistic and racist and sexist. I know all industries are, but it feels like they take a real pride. Do you know what I mean? It feels like it comes up time and time again that you like wouldn't believe the way they think they're the military.
Yeah. So she moves to CBS and she's working on an hour-long weekly magazine show and the Sunday CBS Evening News. And then she finds out at 43 years old that she's pregnant, but she very quickly miscarries. Maury and I were undaunted. I approached having a baby the same way I did investigating a story. I tried to find out what might be wrong, consulting multiple doctors and experts. So she's doing a program called Saturday Night with Connie Chung, where she's doing these long-form news pieces. And it at first gets highly criticized because at first they were doing sort of reenactments.
Okay, and they were right to be criticized, I think.
Oh, me too.
So they tried this new thing where like now we're at the end of the 80s where it's like we got to make as much money as possible. And the news is tilting towards entertainment. So they've come up with this new idea where they're going to reenact historical events and then like describe it as the news. And all channels are doing this. Everybody's like involving a little bit of this. So nobody gets squarely the blame alone, but it is wildly criticized. And they're like, well, how are people going to know it's not real? And everybody's like, well, if you're not stupid, you won't think this is real. It's obviously a historical reenactment, but obviously you cannot reenact history and then call it news because there is a difference.
Yeah.
Of course they couldn't do that. That's just a different thing altogether.
This show, they had to completely restructure it after the first couple runs and end up doing more of a 60 Minutes type show. But she's also guest anchoring for Dan Rather whenever he's busy. And she does a couple of major interviews for Saturday Night with Connie Chung. So Marlon Brando is someone she knows because he's a weirdo.
A bit of a pervert who has a thing for her.
And she's able to do an interview with him. She doesn't even think it's a good interview because he's not giving a lot of information, but it ends up winning an Emmy for like best interview.
Like he refuses to talk about acting because he thinks it's stupid. And he says, I'm interested in everything. I've spent hours and hours watching ants go up and down my sink, picking up crumbs and finding out where they come from.
So one of the more upsetting racist remarks to me came from Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor-in-chief at Cosmo, and her husband was David Brown. So she's having dinner with Helen Gurley Brown and Michael Douglas, and he says, why do you think Connie is so appealing on the news? And Brown said, it's the Asian thing.
It's difficult to describe the feeling we get when we hear comments like this. It's a dirty, alienating jab, as if nothing else about us matters. It's also hard to know how to combat such rude statements from otherwise intelligent people. Is there a way to confront their deeply ingrained prejudice? I empathize greatly with other minorities who face reprehensible bias, often far worse.
So now news is ramping up.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the television news industry devolved from the straight just facts, ma'am approach that was the hallmark of its beginnings. Reporting the news accurately wasn't enough. There was a new paradigm. And of course, she does not love this. She is a big believer that the news anchor's job is to present the facts, to ask the questions, and allow the viewers, the audience, to determine for themselves what rings true. And she believes if you're a good enough interviewer, you can get the interviewee to a place where the audience can tell what's real.
And she says the new form of news created this weird system where now the interviewees hold all the power because they get to decide where they take their interview. And now you have Barbara Walters, Diane Sawyer, Katie Couric. Everybody is fighting to get the interview. She has a couple big interviews that were a huge deal during this time. She interviews the captain of the ExxonMobil ship that spilled all of that oil and killed all the otters.
At one time.
Yeah.
She gets Bill Gates, Paul Newman, and Joanne Woodward.
She gets Magic Johnson's post-HIV revelation interview. And this is kind of funny. She says that from her time in LA, she and Magic were really good friends. And then it turns out Magic Johnson is just like an absolutely charming fella. And everyone he's ever talked to thinks that they're really good friends. He has like a Tom Cruise vibe.
She's very proud of this reporting she did on breast implants. For 20 years, women have been undergoing breast augmentations at the astounding average of 250 implant operations a day in the US. What came as a shock to these women and me was that the most common implant used for the procedure had never been approved by the FDA. So it turned out that there was a lot of women who were feeling incredibly sick after getting their implants, and they found out that the silicone was in fact leaking into their bloodstream and poisoning them. They were being created by the Dow Chemical Company. And after Connie's reporting, the FDA blocked this type of implant. The Dow Company actually went out of business. They went bankrupt. And 14 years later, they brought back the silicone implant, but with FDA precautions and long-term testing. I will say,
I don't know if it worked.
I guess we got closer, but I don't know if it's a cigar.
So then Don Hewitt, who is the EP of 60 Minutes, wants to do a show with Connie, reviving the show Person to Person, where she does long-form interviews.
But they're going to focus on celebrities, and she doesn't want to be another like pop culture, lifestyle, the rich and famous type reporter. She is so upset by the way that people are like, Connie Chung has no journalistic merit. They're always saying that she didn't come up correctly and like earn her stripes and cut her teeth in the trenches. And she's like, yes, I fucking did. I can handle it. She just feels like with every puff piece, she gets reduced to more puff pieces. And she's just like in this hell she can't get out of.
And so then she turns down this offer. And Don Hewitt held a grudge against her for a very long time.
I dared to reject the 1,000-pound gorilla at CBS who enjoyed throwing his weight around. Even Maury asked me if I was sure. I don't know why I didn't pursue it. Later, he said, I don't know why people like you. His negative opinion did not bode well for me. There was no way I would change his mind.
So things are going bad for her at CBS. The ratings are terrible. And they originally want to have her show face-to-face with Connie Chung on Mondays as well. But then just before the fall schedule was announced, they decided to put a different show there instead. They were canceled before they even went to air. And they decide that it would actually make the most sense for Connie to take the fall and say, I couldn't do it because I'm trying to focus on having a baby.
At this point, she had had a lot of miscarriages and was very much struggling to get pregnant or stay pregnant. And so they were going to turn to IVF. And so like she takes the bait and says, all right, I'll make it my own fault.
Well, she says that she believed that her producers had her best interest in mind.
Yeah. So she writes a press briefing saying she is not going to do the show. She's going to focus aggressively on starting her family. And she becomes the laughingstock of nighttime TV.
It's just so heartbreaking to think of the fact that not that long ago, this was in the 90s, a woman could become a laughing stock. Like, it's one thing for people to be like, whatever, to aggressively make fun of her for years and years and years for being someone who's had miscarriages is one of the more psychotic and cruel things I've ever heard.
I should not have agreed to Howard's subterfuge. I should not have taken the blame for the cancellation of my program. What a gigantic mistake. I had not anticipated what was to come. And she had been quite close with David Letterman. They had been like friends and she had done his show a ton and they always laughed and they had a great banter. And after like a year of him making fun of her, she literally wrote him a letter like begging him to stop. And he was like, no, I'm going to keep making fun of you.
So then, despite things going horribly at CBS, her contract is up for renewal and she wants to stay at CBS. So her agent was like, well, let's write in a stipulation that if you stay here, if they decide to have a co-anchor for CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, it has to be you. And then, sure enough, May 14th, 1993, they call her and say, we're going to have a co-anchor for CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, and it's going to be you.
This had been her dream. She couldn't believe it.
Unfortunately, it turns out Dan Rather is a fucking dickhead.
And so the first day, he pretends he's going to be nice to her and then never again. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. He becomes the de facto anchor. So basically any good story he gets to cover. And he literally says to her at one point, it's your job to just shut up and read the prompter. Like, you don't get to leave the desk. You don't get to do real reporting. And as we know about Connie, one thing she is hungry to find truth.
Yeah.
In the field.
I mean, when she first gets hired, he says, now you're going to have to read the newspaper.
And, you know, they wouldn't have brought her in if he was doing well. That's the funny thing. If he had been doing a good job, they wouldn't have changed it. They were desperate because his ratings were tanking.
His ratings were tanking, and he had a couple of really bad moments that made him look horrible. At one point, he was being put on late because a tennis match was running long, and so he just stormed off set, and they spent 7 minutes with dead air because Dan Rather was throwing a tantrum.
It's not very professional. What were you on your period?
7 minutes of dead air is so long.
That's 100 TikToks I could watch.
Yeah. It seems as if he had an inherent bias against women. I felt he perceived women journalists as competitors against one another, like cats scratching each other's eyes out.
He used to say really disrespectful things about other women or presence, which of course just makes you go, okay, well, what are you saying about me? You know, other people around could see what was going on and they would kind of say, hang in there, but nobody was offering her support or like talking to Dan Rather about it. I did hang in, but the job of a lifetime was beginning to be quite a challenge. What came next were assignments that took me down a road of no return.
So Dan Rather gets the serious topics and she gets the fluffy topics. She is assigned to go interview Tanya Harding during the Tanya versus Nancy sitch. And she's just like, this is not journalism.
And every time she gets told that she has to go do these kind of celebrity assignments, she says no, but they force her. How could I object without being called the dreaded name bitch? I'd always taken it upon myself to be the easy child growing up, the one who did the right thing for my parents. Now I was the easy employee, the one who was not difficult, who did not make trouble, the one who did not act like a diva, the peerless good girl who was self-effacing, always the reasonable calm anchor. When hot tempers flared, I stayed cool, no BS. The last thing I wanted was to emulate those pompous, self-absorbed anchormen who had hissy fits. So she would end up doing it.
How embarrassed I was toddling along with Tanya to the Olympics in Norway, not only to co-anchor the CBS Evening News, but to also get yet another interview with Tanya.
She does get good interviews. Like she gets to go to China for the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. She gets to go to Kuwait with President Clinton. But like Dan Rather is freaking out about it and very much taking it out on her.
And the ones that she gets are usually the ones that she has dug for a scoop and then they kind of have to send her. She's always like double time working beyond her producers to find more stories that Dan Rather either won't have time to cover, will be out of town during, or if she gets her hands on it first, sometimes she can get the story first.
Then she's mired in Bitchgate. What's Bitchgate? Basically, when god-awful world's worst man, Newt Gingrich, becomes Speaker of the House, he is like the person to be interviewing. He gets a lot of political capital. He ousts the Democrats for the first time in 20 years. So everyone's trying to get an interview with him. He says no to all interviews, but he'll let you interview his parents and his sisters, which is like, well, what the fuck is that? Connie goes, fine, I'll take it. She goes, she spends 6 hours with the family. They're like on. The dad bakes a cake. They're in the kitchen. Everybody's just being sweetie patootie. And finally she goes, well, has he said anything to you about Clinton? And his mom is like, wow, like does this kind of stage whisper joke.
So the context is she's been doing this stage whisper thing throughout the whole interview. Every time she says something a little bit saucy, she'll be like, well, let me tell you something.
Yeah. Oh my God, that voice freaked me out. It was like too horny a voice.
I was trying to be Mrs. Gingrich, you slut.
Yeah, and I don't like thinking about Mrs. Gingrich as like a, tell me about it, stud.
That was my stage whisper.
Okay. This is my stage whisper.
That's not a good stage whisper.
Deeply unsexual though. Anyway, so the point is, she says, what has Newt told you about President Clinton? Do you want to be Mrs. Gingrich?
Yeah. Nothing. And I can't tell you what what he said about Hillary.
You can't?
I can't.
Why don't you just whisper it to me, just between you and me?
Leaning forward in a stage whisper, she's a bitch. Returning to her normal voice. About the only thing he ever said about her, I think they had some meeting, and she takes over.
She does.
Oh, yeah, but with Nudie there, she can't.
Okay, Nudie.
She says Nudie, not me. I was reading from the script.
I'm still, it doesn't matter who said it first. I am sitting with it.
Nudie patootie.
Okay, so anyway, what happens is this is obviously like big news. And the way Newt Gingrich, however you say his name.
We call him Nudie.
Don't say that. He is not my son. That's not my child.
He's nobody's son.
So he says actually it was Connie's fault for tricking his poor, elderly, stupid little mother and like betraying her like that and essentially forcing her to be awful. And everybody's like, yeah, but did you say that? And he's like, I'm not going to tell you what I said to my mom. That's inappropriate. Blah, blah, blah. So then Connie is
lambasted
by all of the powers that be that she is so unprofessional, that she's too awful.
Her producers acknowledge that they fucked up by just releasing that clip and not releasing the broader interview where this whisper thing is happening the whole time. I will say there is like a handful of people who are a little bit responsible, but none more responsible than Newt Gingrich for calling Hillary Clinton a bitch.
Or his honestly dumb bitch mom for saying it.
Yeah.
I think you get to call a woman a bitch in the privacy of your own house.
Hillary Clinton does seem like a bitch. Not a bigger bitch than Newt, but still.
Anyway, it's not Connie's fault.
There is a lot of competition between women in journalism, but it is also the women who have each other's back. 2 female reporters lambasted Speaker Gingrich for throwing his own mother under the bus. One wrote, if Kathleen Gingrich chooses to say on national television that her son called Hillary Clinton a bitch, why is his only claim that his mother was duped? Frankly, I resent his patronizing tone. Just because your mom is not a professional politician doesn't mean she's an idiot.
But everyone else was like, Connie Chung is a fucking see you next Tuesday. Even people who are like experts in journalism were given the clip and they're like, what do you think? And they're like, she's awful, that Connie. And then like a week later, they're like, hey, by the way, I watched that whole clip. I shouldn't have said that about you. You did good journalism.
And it was just too late.
I thought the Gingrich controversy was the worst incident I would face while co-anchoring the CBS Evening News, but what was to come made Bitchgate pale in comparison. Oh, this is crazy.
This is awful.
So on April 19th of 1995, there is a bombing in Oklahoma City. Dan Rather's on vacation. Connie calls up and says, let me get over there. I'll fly right now. She gets out there ASAP. She does tons of on-the-ground reporting. She's talking to everybody. You know how Connie works. I mean, she's barely sleeping. She's interviewing firefighters and children and victims and parents and everyone she can get her hands on. She's doing incredible coverage from the ground. She goes home after a couple of days, and Dan Rather comes back from vacation and is so pissed that he didn't get to go. He goes to do more coverage. She later finds out that what he did there was he was overheard by multiple other journalists making calls to the press and on background absolutely ridiculing and tearing down Connie, saying she did a deeply unprofessional job. He started putting stories in the press that she was like doing all these horrific things to get an interview, like dressing up like a nurse to go into the hospital and meet victims who were in the hospital, dressing up like a priest to break into a funeral. There was all these accusations. And then they started saying that she was really disrespectful to the firefighters. And then the town of Oklahoma City like turned on her. And teenagers started writing her letters saying, get out of our cities. Your reporting was so cruel. You don't care about us at all. We're just a story to you. There was no humanity in it. And she is absolutely ripped apart in the press and by the people for her reporting.
And even the firefighter was like, she didn't do bad reporting. I felt very good about our interview. And then she still had to like go on air and apologize to him.
He wouldn't actually let her apologize because he said, I'm not going to participate. You didn't do anything wrong.
Overall, now the story, because of Dan Rather, has turned to her being this unethical, vicious, inhumane reporter.
She didn't know until she wrote this book and did some research. And he was like, I can't tell you who told me, but people overheard it. And he never denied it. Locals printed t-shirts that read, who the hell is Connie Chung? The back read, bite me, Connie Chung. High school students wrote me letters saying they were offended by my reporting, tone of voice, and facial expressions. A Tulsa newspaper published a letter from a reader who told me to go home and not come back.
So eventually it comes down to it where Dan Rather had gone to the executives and said it's her or me, and it was him.
A month later, my world collapsed. It was just before the 6:30 on Thursday in April 1995. She was about to go on air and she gets a call from her agent saying, hey, this is your last day. The producers that she had been working with closely for 2 years weren't even man enough to tell her. She said, if I were the boss, I would be man enough to look my employee in the eye and tell her myself.
When I walked off the set for the last time, it felt like I'd left my life behind.
Of course, she's heartbroken, but little does she know, life has other things in store. 2 days later, she gets a call that an adoption has gone through and her little baby boy would be born.
She does end up having the time to really raise her son. And there's this really beautiful moment where all of the powerful women in journalism throw her this incredible brunch.
Like a goodbye party.
And it really made me tear up. And just like we support you. We know you weren't treated well by the news party.
She got all these letters, notes, flowers, cards to our favorite scapegoat. A male television critic sent flowers with the note, screw the bastards. Everybody was just like, anybody who knows anything knows that you're great. Anyone who's worked with you knows that you're great. We all see what you're up against and we're all on your side.
At this brunch, it was organized by Leslie Stahl. Barbara Walters was there. Nancy Dickerson, the first correspondent that she ever watched when she was a little girl. Erin Moriarty, Jane Pauley, Katie Couric, Sylvia Chase. It was just like a who's who of women in the industry all coming together to support her. And that was very beautiful. But it also is just so sad that there was nothing that could be done. It is really great that all of these women could come together and support each other. But also what it leads to is still inching forward, clawing at sheetrock.
Now I was about to move into another world, a world of diapers, sleepless nights, and the unsurpassed joy of a new kind of love of my son. So they very quickly have to pack everything up. They're going to pick up their son in California. They go out, they meet him, and immediately there's leaks. And they're all about not letting anybody know that they have this kid. And I guess she was a real news ticket item at the time. So they go into hyper overdrive to make sure nobody gets a photo of them. And they all fly back from picking up her son separately.
She's like, we all flew back. Me, Maury, and Matthew all split up. And I was like, well, Matthew was 1 day old.
The baby? You checked the baby?
They had him nurse fly the baby.
It still felt really intense. She was like, well, the worst thing that could happen is somebody could find out. And I was like, why? She was very anxious because it was a closed adoption. And for 1 year, they are allowed to undo the adoption. You get 12 months in the state of New York to take your baby back, basically. And so she had this anxiety that a photo leaked and somebody saw. I don't know. She just was on edge. But after that year, she was a full-time mom and she was really happy and she loved her baby and they had quite a little routine.
And then she gets a fellowship at Harvard,
which she loves. And like slowly but surely, the industry comes kind of knocking on her door.
She ends up going back to ABC.
She does a 4-part series for PBS.
And then she was going to co-anchor a new edition of 2020. But what happened essentially is that she became a pawn between Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer.
So they were on the same channel.
Yeah, it was Barbara Walters' 2020. But then Barbara would constantly be competing with Diane for stories. And then Connie couldn't get any story that Diane or Barbara wanted. And then they would constantly play Connie against each other. So she was this weird pawn in the Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters game. It just went up in flames. It was.
She
was
just
situation.
like, I don't understand why we had to act like that. She said, what it did push me to do is find stories that nobody wanted. And I thought that those were actually much more important stories. And so instead of doing like national breaking headline news, she was really like helping the voiceless and getting people's stories told.
And she like got another Emmy for one of those stories. Then she gets brought over to CNN where she's anchoring the evening news, but she doesn't last very long there because there's new management and the new management is assholes.
And they're like, well, you're new. We'll get rid of you. And then she does a show with Maury and it does so badly that she does this like weird parody song at the end. And then that gets mocked. And they're like, why did you do that, Connie? And she's like, I didn't think anyone was watching. I thought we got canceled because nobody was watching. It turns out you were all watching. How could that be true?
But she really sums it up by saying this whole book was catharsis. For so long, she didn't ever consider herself in any of these stories. She never considered herself at all. It was all work, 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 work. And then it was like work or personal life. But she realized that it is okay to put her thoughts down and like let her feelings out.
And then it ends with the story about Connie Wang.
Yeah, she worked at Refinery 29.
And she wrote this article about the impact of being named Connie. And it was the first time she ever thought about herself as a success. She was like, wait a minute, I was like important to people and people looked up to me.
And it turns out there's this whole generation of Asian women named Connie from the late 70s, 80s, and 90s that were named after Connie Chung, and all of these parents who were like, you will be like Connie Chung. There's an article I'm going to read for the Patreon, Generation Connie.
I now realize that mine is a story of triumph. Dare I say it? How remarkable that I've never been able to declare myself a success. For those of us who are driven, we perpetually see another mountain to climb and success is ephemeral. But I think I just may be able to, at this stage of my life, shed my reluctance to declare success and embrace it. For that, I owe deep gratitude to Connie Wang and to the parents who named the daughters Connie.
So I think to me, this story, even though it is kind of heartbreaking to see, like, you can spend your entire life working as hard as humanly possible and still never make the inroads you hoped to make. However, I think what's hopeful about it is that making an impact isn't just about your lifetime. And so the fact that even though in her lifetime she still feels that she was disrespected and treated like shit, and she was disrespected and treated like shit, but like her impact created a whole new generation of Connies that will be able to push the envelope even further forward. And like those Connies will create more Connies that like can keep on building upon something that she created with the help of women like Nancy Dickerson. What are your thoughts? How fertile would you consider this soil?
I want to go somewhere between a 3.5 and a 4. I do find it so interesting, just like the project of Memoir for her. And she discusses it head on. The difficulties of purging into emotions and opinion when her whole life has been dedicated to like the pursuit of facts and like straight storytelling, which I find very interesting. I feel very inspired by her. I also felt a little bit heartbroken. We are doing a collab coming soon where we had to read Lean In. And I think Lean In also had this similar energy of like, we thought it was going to get so much better. And then at some point it just stopped getting better. Why? And I think this week was the election. It was hard.
Yeah.
I do agree that there is this like, just because you can't see it in front of you doesn't mean the progress doesn't exist. Like you start this book and she's so hopeful and excited and hardworking and she like feels good, like it's happening. Like there's this sense that there's this momentum and it's happening. And of course she gets to the highest echelons.
Like she was still the first female co-anchor of an evening news program in like 16 years.
And she is up against the most competitive people. I don't know, it just got harder and harder. And that's not what you like to think about, the bent of justice or
It's
whatever.
hard to believe that as she got more successful, people were less supportive.
I guess like when you say it like that, I do believe it. I think for me, it was like the time that the idea that like 40 years later, it was worse than it was.
Yeah. Anyway, I would give it like a 3.8 because I feel like there were parts that got bogged down in just like explaining Watergate.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there is that newscaster story problem of when you've been near all the breaking news in the world. How do you like determine which story is the most important or which story is even yours?
But I think that like between those parts, she is a great teller of her own story.
Yeah. And I do think she is such an incredible role model. Like, I can't believe how lucky all the Connies in the world are to find out that this person that they thought represented like bravery and taking risks and working hard and achieving something like really is an incredibly hardworking, brave, ballsy, like the life she lived for the time she was born, for her to like not really get married till she was 40 and then like get to have her career on her own terms and still end up having a child on her own terms. And like, she's so happy with the way that her life panned out in that sense of getting to have it all at different time periods that might not be the traditional pacing of things. Like, she really was the master of her own fate in all the ways she could be. And she is like such an inspiration.
Yeah.
She seems like a cool bitch. And
yeah.
I would like to have like three or four worm-tinis.
I think she'd be able to like drink us under the table.
Oh, I have like no doubt that I'd be like 3 in and like
I'd be like, Connie, you're so beautiful. And she'd be like, well, you've got to sit up straighter if you want to not look like a fucking idiot on your show.
And she'd be dead right, man.
And I would say, God.
And who are our favorite peeps?
Oh, our favorite are the 5-star reviewing wormies who I love.